Hey there, I'm Trent, and welcome to the first official recorded episode of Entry Level Esports. This is going to be our question and answer show where you, as the viewer, can submit your questions on Twitter about anything relating to esports, Here's the Storm competition, that sort of thing, and they will potentially get answered on the show. This week, we've got a question from @AKA Loxley, who asks, does HOTS have the potential to be the strongest esport Blizzard has? And the reason I picked this question is, at surface level, it kind of is an easy no at the moment because we've got Overwatch and Hearthstone that are such popular games and have such prominent news things happening about them right now, with Hearthstone having a new card release, Overwatch having the Overwatch League kicking off in January. But what I wanted to do is use this as an opportunity to kind of talk about the key features that make something a successful esport, and that way we can judge these three games that Blizzard has as their most popular esports right now on those metrics and kind of see where Here's the Storm stands and where it might be going in the future. So, and just real quick, the reason that we're not touching on World of Warcraft right now or StarCraft is because World of Warcraft is not really esports focused right now. That's not really Blizzard's primary directive with that game right now, whereas they're making a lot of moves with these three games specifically. And StarCraft is kind of its own self-sustaining entity right now. It's not really experiencing a lot of transition and growth. It's kind of been going for a while. The resurgence of Brood War and StarCraft Remastered is interesting, but we need a little bit more time with that game out and active before we really get a feel for what Blizzard wants to do with it. So today we're going to focus primarily on comparing and contrasting Heroes to Overwatch and Hearthstone. So when we're looking at what makes something a strong or successful esport, we need to look at 5 things. Those 5 things are developer support, having an active player base, organic growth, gameplay depth, and interesting personalities. These are really the 5 core things that a game needs to have in order to be a successful esport. We're going to talk about some examples of each as we go. So the first piece we need to look at is going to be developer support. Now, developer support, when we're defining developer support, what we mean is that the developer of the game has a specific and active role in sustaining the esports of that game. So for Blizzard right now is very, very active in the esports of all 3 of these games. You know, they have the Hearthstone Invitational and all of the World Cups that go on throughout the year, all these tournaments that take place in various regions. They use all of their popular streamers and competitors as promotional tools when they're bringing out a new set and things like that. Overwatch has a real obvious example with the Overwatch League, and then Heroes of the Storm has the HGC, BlizzCon, Gold Club, all of these big league infrastructure things that they've implemented in 2017. So all 3 games have really active developer support by Blizzard at this point in their development. And developer support is important for a number of reasons. It provides the most prize money. Any game, if you look at any game right now, the biggest prize pools always come from the developer, whether that's Street Fighter with the Capcom Cup, whether that's Dota 2 with the International, whether that's Heroes of the Storm with BlizzCon. The biggest prize pools and the most prestigious tournaments always come from the developer putting that money into the game. In addition to that, rules enforcement is a really important part of developer support. Because the developer controls the game and often controls the league, controls players' access to the game, they have the strongest ability to encourage behavior, to punish players, to fine organizations, because they're the ones that control the most about the game. You know, like in League of Legends, when a player has toxicity in solo queue and things like that, Riot, because they run the LCS, has the ability to, because that player is a pro player in their league and has signed a contract to conduct themselves a certain way, not only can they fine and ban that player in the LCS, they can also suspend all of that player's accounts, Whereas if that league was run by the WESA or by the ESL or MLG, they wouldn't have that extra step that they could go to actually suspend player accounts and get that player out of the solo queue pool because they don't have that authority where the developer does. And this is a huge problem that we see in Super Smash Bros., the most prominent example of a game that is successful but doesn't have developer support. They've been able to survive because of the other things we're going to talk about in a bit, but the two things that we've just talked about, Super Smash Bros. Really struggles with finding a lot of prize money to promote their game because there's just not a lot of prize money to be won. You know, the most prestigious tournament of the year, the Evolution Championship, the 7th place team gets $100. Like, they barely even cover their hotel for the weekend because there's no prize support from Nintendo. In addition to that, rule enforcement is a really big issue in Super Smash Bros. If a player has misconduct or if a rule needs to be changed about competition, all of the tournament organizers, because they're all separate and there's no centralized official governing body, everyone kind of has to agree to abide by those rules. If a player needs to be banned, if a rule needs to be changed, there are a lot of times where different regions, different tournaments may not choose to abide by those rules if they don't agree, and it really hurts the ability of Super Smash Bros. To enforce behavior and to enforce rules that they want changed because they don't have that developer support forcing everybody to adapt to one centralized rule set. In addition to that, developer support provides game balance. Obviously, if the developers don't care about esports, they don't care about balancing for esports. So you'll get way more mismatched and overpowered heroes. You'll get exploits on maps and glitches that don't get changed, these kinds of things that really, really affect competition, and features don't get added to the game that really promote the esports of the game because that's not the developer's goal with their game. So developer support is really important for that. And in addition to that, just having more power for marketing, production, and watchability, all of these features and assets that the developer has at their disposal that a grassroots esports organization wouldn't have access to. The developer just has more resources at their disposal to make their game successful. So that's why developer support is so important. And if we're looking at these three games, as we said before, all three really have a ton of developer support, though right now, Overwatch by far has the most developer support because of the Overwatch League. You see Blizzard pouring millions of dollars into geolocating it, into getting major investors involved, into building up players with their videos that they're putting out. You know, right now, in terms of developer support, Overwatch is the clear winner out of Blizzard's games. That said, they are putting a ton of effort into the HGC, into adding prize support for BlizzCon, into tweaking their rules every year. We've seen a lot of new rules for the 2018 HGC really improve the quality of and sustainability of the tournament and of the league. And I think that Blizzard is committed to supporting heroes, though in terms of comparing the games, Overwatch is the clear winner on developer support. The next piece that's super important for an esport to be successful is having an active player base. No matter how much marketing you do, no matter how much you talk to your friends and tell them that this game is cool, esports are fundamentally difficult for a new player to get invested into because they need to be able to understand the flow of the game. They need to be able to understand the win conditions. They need to be able to understand why things are happening, who's winning and who's losing. And fundamentally, most esports, it's very, very difficult for you to tell those things if you don't actually play the game. So always in every game, the biggest draw for your viewership is always going to be from the player base that's actually playing the game. So you can kind of see esports viewership as a percentage of the total active players in the game. So by that same token, in order to have a successful esport, you have to have a pretty popular game, because there's just no reason for the developer to invest, for sponsors to invest, for esports organizations to invest if the viewership isn't there, if the fan base isn't there, and if the fan base is always going to be a percentage of the player base, then you're always going to need an active player base and a growing player base in order to sustain an esport. In addition to that, having an active player base and a big player base increases your talent pool. It brings in more new players. It brings in more competitive talent and competitive rookies into the game so that we constantly see a turnover in competition and we see more competitive matches. So having a big player base to draw our competitors from and to draw our viewers from is critical to a sustainable, popular esport. And if we look at comparing our three games, right now, Overwatch and Hearthstone have overwhelmingly more active players than Heroes does, but Heroes is still consistently a strong competitor in the space. You know, it's the third tier MOBA, having been the fourth most popular MOBA to come out behind League, Dota, and Smite. It has overtaken Smite in popularity in terms of Twitch viewership, esports activity, prize pools, and active players. We're probably not ever going to catch up to League of Legends and Dota just because they've been out for so long and they offer different things from Heroes. However, Blizzard has, over 2017, we've seen them put a ton of resources into leveraging their other active users in other games to bring them into Heroes of the Storm. So while when we're comparing to the other games, Heroes of the Storm isn't necessarily the most popular in terms of active players, it does have that unique draw, that Super Smash Brothers style appeal, where it's kind of Blizzard the video game. And so we can draw players in much more easily from the other games that are more popular or have more active users, because when a new Overwatch hero comes out, a bunch of people from Overwatch are going to come and check it out. If there's rewards in Overwatch for playing heroes, we've seen that bring in a ton of players. If there's rewards in World of Warcraft and Hearthstone, we've seen that bring in players. And a lot of the time, those players stick around. If we look at activity on Reddit metrics, active user time, these marketing tools are really, really successful in drawing players into Heroes of the Storm. So while Heroes of the Storm might be third in terms of active users now, we might be able to see over time Heroes actually have the most potential for growth long-term out of the three games, specifically because when players become disenfranchised with Overwatch, Hearthstone, World of Warcraft, they may not necessarily disappear to another game in that genre. They may first check out Heroes of the Storm because it has those characters that they love competing in a different style of game that's a change of pace, but doesn't necessarily lose them that connection to those characters that they've become invested in. So I think Heroes has potential to really, really grow its active player base over the next 3 to 4 years, which will directly translate to a significant spike in esports growth. Along with that, we talked about one of the pillars being organic growth. Organic growth is super important to an esport. What we mean by organic growth is the start of an esport has to come from the community. You know, developers may want their game to be an esport, but if the community doesn't decide that it's an esport first, that has never worked out. There's been a number of games that in their beta have tried to start their own esports. Infinite Crisis is a famous example of this, where it was a MOBA with DC characters like Superman and Batman that was trying to compete with League of Legends. And early in their beta, they were bringing in League pros to play matches. They were organizing tournaments with prize pools and having developers cast those tournaments. And they weren't really allowing the community to figure out the competitive bent of their game. They were just trying to force it. And that led to the structure of their tournaments not being ideal, but nobody else was really trying to create other tournaments and experiment with how to make this game competitive, because the developer was already doing that, and all of the players' time was invested in competing into those developer-supported tournaments because they had the best payout, they were the most high profile, and because of that, the community was never allowed to organically grow around the game, and the game pretty quickly died thereafter. And we've seen that time and time again with games where the developers try to force an esport before the community really gets a chance to figure out what their game is as a competitive title. And with Heroes, we actually saw that. the first 2 years of Heroes, the majority of tournaments were things like Bloodlust, things like Lords of the Storm. We saw guys like Solid Jake and Sham2 organizing tournaments. We saw the ESL majors come into the scene and be the pinnacle of the game for a while. And out of all of that, Blizzard took all of that structure, allowed for these organizations to grow up, allowed these players to grow up within the scene until there was enough competition in the game to sustain a league. And then their first significant contribution to the game was to organize a league. If they had not started out with that organic growth first, the league would never have been as successful as it's been this past year, because there wouldn't have been that foundation underneath it. So because we had that organic growth first, we've been able to see Heroes sustain and continue to grow because we had that organic growth first. And this is one of the places where Heroes has an opportunity to overtake the other two games, because Blizzard is really forcing Overwatch right now. Overwatch had some organic growth early on, but we started to see viewership dip. We started to see investment in Overwatch teams start to retreat, especially after Blizzard announced the Overwatch League was going to be so finally restricted, and there was such a barrier to entry to the Overwatch League that we've seen the Overwatch esports scene completely stagnate for almost a year because they knew the Overwatch League was going to be coming out, and Overwatch really as an esport isn't to the point yet where the Overwatch League makes the most sense for that game compared to games like League, Dota, Rocket League, Street Fighter, these other games that are more established, that have larger viewership, that are more watchable. So if the Overwatch League ends up not being successful, it could really set Overwatch esports back. There's no way to know if that's going to be the case or not. Blizzard is putting a lot into making sure it's successful, but because Overwatch wasn't allowed all of that time to organically grow before the Overwatch League came out, there's a potential there for Heroes to be the more sustainable esport long term. So while the Overwatch League is going to make Overwatch a bigger esport in 2018, that stability that we had early on in Heroes could allow it to overtake the other games in the long term because it has a larger, more sustainable pool to draw from because of our grassroots organic origins. So the fourth piece we want to look at is gameplay depth. Gameplay depth is a hugely important factor in creating an esport. If you don't have depth in your gameplay, there's just only so far that the game can grow over time. It also causes players to get disenfranchised with the game over time because your most competitive players are going to be exploring the game the most, finding ways to find exploits and to find optimizations in the game, and they need reward for that time investment in order to keep investing in the game, to keep growing the game, to keep finding new things to do. And that is kind of twofold, because one, it allows the players to find more reward and to sustain themselves in playing the game long term, but it also allows the viewers to get more invested and to find more things that are exciting about the game. And this is a huge reason why without developer support, Super Smash Bros. Melee has been so successful, is because the game is so deep that even 16 years later, players are finding new technology, new ways to optimize their characters. We've seen Fox, who was a character that was almost never played in the early days of Melee, become the strongest character in the game because over time players have found ways to optimize his playstyle and find new tech to use with that character that has allowed the game to completely change and be revolutionized in the last 5-10 years because people keep finding new things about it. And Heroes of the Storm is actually the deepest game that Blizzard has in its catalog. Overwatch has a ton of skill in terms of skill accuracy with shooting, with character knowledge, with mobility. There's a lot more freedom and movement in Overwatch, but You have mirror matches on either side, which restricts the depth in team composition. There's no draft to the game, which removes a layer of complexity and player skill. It removes an entire skill set from the talent pool. Whereas Heroes, not only does it have different maps, not only does it have new characters and new characters coming out all the time to find new optimizations for and new compositions for, the cross section of the two with having multiple maps and multiple characters means that players have to constantly find new ways to optimize not only the maps, but the characters and compositions that are strongest on those maps. And each new character that comes out completely changes that dynamic. In addition to that, we have the talent system, which every time Blizzard reworks a hero's talents and finds better ways to optimize the way that their talent system works, it adds a new layer of complexity to heroes. In addition to the fact that it's just a skill-intensive game to play because of needing to have high APM, high skill shot accuracy, high map awareness because of things like crowd-controlled ganks from stealth bushes, things like that. People in the comments might argue about if Heroes is more skillful than League or Dota. It isn't, but it has enough skill depth combined with the knowledge depth required that actually make it far and away the most deep game that Blizzard has in its roster. So combined with the other things that we've seen with Heroes slowly and organically growing over time, that depth is going to keep players invested longer and keep them being rewarded more. And as viewers, we're going to see new optimizations, new tech, new dynamics come up every single time that Blizzard tweaks anything, so that when we're watching Heroes of the Storm 10 years from now, it's going to be a completely different game, even though it has the same bones that it's always had. So that depth is really encouraging if you're a Heroes of the Storm fan. And then the last thing that is really ultimately the most important out of anything for sustaining an esport long term is having interesting personalities. Sports at their core are not about watching people compete in a game. At their core, why we watch sports is to see human stories develop and to see human stories told that are real and create a drama that we don't get in our regular life, but is believable because it's not something that we're seeing in a movie or a TV show. Sports are the most interesting soap opera that you could ever watch because it's real. And having interesting personalities is a key component in that. And this is the area where I think Blizzard really needs to focus with Heroes of the Storm, because right now it's lagging behind the other two games because we don't have that level of promotion with our personalities. Heroes has a lot of great personalities. Players like Quacknix, like Michael Udall, like Hooligan, these players that are loud and outspoken, that are charismatic, that look good on camera. They create an emotional connection for fans. But what Blizzard needs to step up in doing now with Heroes that they're doing with Overwatch, with the videos that they've been doing leading up to the Overwatch League, with using Hearthstone players in their promotion and in their various supplementary content around the game, the personalities in those two games are much more visible and much more heavily pronounced than they are in Heroes. So right now, this, I think, is the place where Heroes is the furthest behind in the three games. But because we do have those interesting characters in the scene, as soon as we figure out how to properly expose those heroes, how to properly tell their stories, and how to create interesting storylines that aren't just about Tempo Storm versus Roll20, but are about, Glaurung versus his old team, are about Cure finding his way to continue to grow in the league and establish himself as a star, about Goku's drive to be the best player in the world and to be regarded as such unquestionably by his peers and by his fans. These storylines that we have already in the game aren't being pronounced yet. And once they are, I think that's where we will see Heroes of the Storm really take off. So in conclusion, to answer the question that was asked at the start, do I think that Heroes of the Storm has the potential to be the strongest esport Blizzard has? Absolutely. I think if we look at these 5 pillars, developer support, active player base, organic growth, gameplay depth, and interesting personalities, I think Heroes of the Storm is behind the other games right now at the end of 2017, but it has the foundation in each of those aspects that it could overtake the other games long term and ultimately be more sustainable than any of the other games that Blizzard has in its arsenal. And so it's very, very possible that 5 years from now, Heroes of the Storm is far and away the strongest esports title that Blizzard has in its arsenal. So, AKA Loxley, I hope that answers your question. And if you would like to have your question answered on the next episode of Entry Level Esports, be sure to follow TrollsGG on Twitter and myself at Trent_Esports to find out when we're putting out the tweet that you can reply to in order to get your question answered. And who knows, you might be the topic of conversation for the next show. This has been Entry Level Esports, and we will see you next time. Have a good one.